Miscarriage and infant loss are experiences that disproportionately affect Indigenous women and women of color. What God is Honored Here is the first book of its kind, a literary collection of voices of these women coming together to speak about the traumas and tragedies of womanhood. Editors Shannon Gibney and Kao Kalia Yang are joined here by writers Michelle Borok, Soniah Kamal, Jami Nakamura Lin, and Seema Reza. This edited conversation was recorded in July 2020.
So, my name is Shannon Gibney. I'm one of the co editors of the anthology What God is Honored Here, Writings on Miscarriage and Infant Loss by and for Native Women and Women of Color. My co editor is Kao Kalia Yang, and the book was published in October 2019 by University of Minnesota Press. We have some of our amazing contributors here. We have Jami Nakamura Lin, Michelle Borok, Soniah Kamal, and we also have Seema Reza here. And so we're going to talk a bit about the book itself. We're going to talk a bit about what it's been like 8 months or so now having the book out in the world. So thanks for joining us.
Hello, this is Kalia speaking. Thank you, Shannon, for leading us off. It's been nearly a year. It doesn't feel like it's been a year, partly because we've been in a pandemic. Um, After the publication of a book, generally, you spend a whole year at least going through bookstores and organizing readings and gathering folk. This has not been the case. We started out strong by doing lots of readings around different communities across the nation. But for the last few months, it's been very quiet on my end. This has been the quietest book I've had the privilege and the honor of working on. How has it been for the rest of you?
This is Michelle Borok. Yeah, time is sort of compressed, um, just in general, because I think I'm calling in from Mongolia. We went into lockdown in January. Um, sort of watching the rest of the world carry on, and was like, oh, that would be nice. But now here we are, and we're all in the same boat. Um, but yeah, time is really compressed, and it didn't really occur to me to think about what Kalia raised is just that you guys would have continued with the readings and the events, which were just really amazing to see from a distance. You guys had some really great events and conversations at those events, I'm assuming, and it would have been amazing to see those continue.
Hi, yeah, this is Soniah Kamal. I'm the author of two novels, Unmarriageable and An Isolated Incident, and it's for the book world. I think it's been hard in general, but the book world seems to be particularly hit by this. I actually my second novel was launched in An Isolated Incident was launched in England yesterday, and it's just because publishing has pushed so many books forward. It's just because everyone is very confused with what to do and how to do it, because timelines have all shifted for bookstores, and everyone's still getting a hang on Zoom and how to do things. So it's been a surreal experience to have. On the other hand, there's also gratitude for those of us who are, able to stay safe and still able to do things at this time.
Yeah, this is Seema. I'm calling in from Maryland. I'm the author of When the World Breaks Open, a memoir, and A Constellation of Half Lives, which is a collection of poetry. Um, the essay that I was able to contribute to the anthology is from my memoir, and it is about my experience with having to decide to have a late term abortion because my son was very sick. And in this time of being home and watching like what's happening in the world and the attacks on women's rights, the events have had been so sacred and beautiful, the two readings that I went to, but to put it on the internet feels much scarier. And um, and that's been an interesting thing to be like, well, if I want the world to know, I guess the whole world has to know. And that's been kind of a scary and liberating thing.
Hi, this is Jami Nakamura Lin, and I'm a writer from outside Chicago. You were mentioning that it's been almost a year, and it seems so strange that that time has passed because it seems like such a long time. You know, it seems like ages and ages, and it also seems very short that I was able to be with some of you at St. Kate's at the reading, which was such a beautiful moment just to spend time in person. And now thinking back on what it means to be in community, and now how most of our community is virtual, I just think back on that moment really fondly. And I think the reaction I've had from people has been like a slow burn for this book. You know, recently I had a friend who I gave the anthology to, and she said, I know you gave this to me, but is it okay if I give it to one of my friends because I think she really needs it right now, because she had just had a miscarriage. So it's cool to me to hear stories like that, you know, a long time after the book came out, about it going hand to hand from person to person of people who need it at that time in their lives. And that woman was also a woman of color. And I think being a person of color, I just felt like there weren't any books that really spoke to me when I was going through these things, which was why like it was been such a meaningful experience to be part of this book, and to see that it's continuing to be shared with that community is really wonderful.
Yeah, this is Shannon Gibney again, and I like the image of the slow burn, or I think Kalia even called it, you know, trying to light a fire in a damp forest, um, because it's, you know, nobody really wants to talk about dead babies. It's just that the topic of the book itself is just really hard, but that's also why it's so needed. Kalia and I have said before how we, yeah, very lucky. There was a lot of local interest in the book, right, when it came out. And so we had a lot of readings and events, and both of us are pretty well established, at least in Minnesota. And so we have, you know, our events typically fill, and that wasn't necessarily the case for this book. But every event, someone would come up to us and just kind of commiserate. You know, I had one woman at a reading at Next Chapter Bookstore, and she's probably in her 50s, white woman, and she said, you know, after you read your piece, um, and of course she's, you know, she's crying like a lot of the folks who share their stories with us are, and she's like, I never was able to just say what happened. I was never able to just say my baby died. She's like, I just, the language that I used, I had to like dance around it, you know, for everybody else, kind of because they just couldn't bear it. And she's like, and I never realized what a weight that was before. She's just like, I just exhaled, um, listening to your story. And that was just so moving to me. So stories like that, we were talking in a radio program. There was probably a 50 something Native American gentleman who was talking about how he had a sibling, you know, between him and his younger sister, or younger sibling, you know, that his mom mentioned it from time to time, but you know, you could see that it's part of their family story in a certain way, but perhaps not necessarily in a way that has been, I guess, like as healing as it could have been. So I think this book, like so many others, is multi-layered, and I think just in quote unquote normal non-COVID-19 times, I think that it's something that is just going to take a little while to get out into all those hands of community folks who really need it. But I have heard, like Jami, from actually quite a few folks in my community. It's so gratifying to have something to actually give um, my friend or my sister or somebody in my family that's just experienced a loss. Um, and that's also gratifying as well. COVID-19 times, I mean, I do feel like, yeah, we've had to just pivot. All of us have to be just open to whatever's going to unfold because nobody really knows. Obviously, it's not exactly what we would have wanted, but it also presents some other opportunities in terms of people being able to engage with the book virtually. University of Minnesota Press has had it on their website all summer for folks to download for free, which is really awesome as part of this racial justice initiative. So yeah.
I had a conversation with my dad. My father doesn't he doesn't ask me very often about the books that I'm writing or the books that have come out. But he was there at the first night of the launch events, and he heard me read from my mother's story, from their story. Recently, my dad he looked up at me. I was in the garage with him. We were swatting flies. This is an activity that I do with my dad often, swatting flies in the garage. And he says to me, "You know that book that you published last year that's been very quiet?" I knew exactly which one he was talking about. He said, "I think about it so often." My father said to me, sometimes you write the books that everybody wants to read, and sometimes you're in a place where you have to write the books that the world needs, but the world will never know it, until it does. And I looked at my dad and I said, I hope you're right. But shortly after that conversation, when George Floyd was murdered brutally here in Minneapolis, the very last words that he said, he called her his mom. My mother, when I visited my mom and dad, my mother broke down and she said, I'm crying and I'm crying for his mother. I'm crying for myself. I'm crying for all of the mothers in your book. I didn't expect these connections to happen in my home in these ways. But I think that's been one of the most, one of the big gifts of this collection, Shannon. I've not told you about this, and all of you wonderful, powerful, strong women. But I think these personal conversations that are coming forth are changing me as much as it is changing the landscape that I hope this book enters into.
Thank you for that, Kalia. Yeah, and I just feel like, I've had people tell me, like, your most, ardent supporters for this book, you're probably not going to hear from them, right? Like those conversations that you have, with your dad in the garage swatting flies, it's not in front of a podium, it's not at some big launch event. It's just the dailiness of life, but creating a space for that. I mean, to me, that's the aim of art. Is it should be creating space when there for things that there's not space for right now.
I'm curious because so many of, I think all of us are writers. Your contributions to what God is honored here, how does that differ from the other work that you do?
This is Jami. I think for me, actually, the piece that I did here kind of launched me on a new path of writing, because I was having such a hard time writing about my miscarriage. I was having such a hard time writing about my father's impending death, and I didn't know how to write about it. And then when I saw the call for this anthology, I knew I really wanted to be part of it. And I started thinking about how I could write about it. And then I started using the lens of Japanese mythology to kind of talk about these really difficult things. And after that, I started using that for a lot of other writing I've been doing. So it kind of was the launch point, or the beginning of me being able to write in a new and different way. And now I've been having a lot of essays that follow in the same vein. I think it has just helped me realize the power of writing about this, and how I can use that in my other writing too, of a lot of other difficult topics.
This is Michelle Borok. I can jump in. I haven't actually um been writing a lot. So but I've recently kickstarted things again. It's weird because I think my relationship with that essay, in some ways, like a door kind of closed, maybe on saying like the hardest thing, and now like everything should be easier to talk about, like after talking about the worst thing that ever happened. But yeah, it's just a weird time to pick up, momentum again. It was such a heavy thing to write about and then to have published, that it's strange to think about what the next thing might be. So I've done, other things, writing related, but I haven't written anything that's been published since. So it's weird. It's a bit heavy. I don't know what it is.
This is Seema. I'm a performing poet and I read a lot of uncomfortable things on stage, but this I had never read before the book launch, this particular tragic and traumatic experience. And similar to what Michelle said, like that unlocking of, or that breaking down of that barrier of like, oh, I can give this to a room to hold with me. I think it was Shannon who said nobody wants to talk about dead babies. Nobody wants to, right? That's just like not the way that you necessarily, you don't want to be the one to bring that into the space. But similar to what Shannon was saying, when I have brought it, it's amazing how many other people have this same experience. And what I keep thinking about is what else do I think is so completely, privately, terribly my own that actually is shared pretty widely? And where can I else can I find that courage in my writing to put it on the page, to enter, through the doorway of the page into that story, and then maybe find those points of connection in the world, which is, why I write. So it's been amazing to be out in the world with this book.
This is Sonia. You know what I found for miscarriage and things like this is that it's not drawing room conversation like, hello, my name is, how are you, this happened to me. But once you start sharing with people, everyone suddenly starts telling their stories too. And you realize that as much as there's willful silence around it, because it is a discomforting subject, and people are shy about also not so much not wanting to share, but there seems to be, they don't want to upset anyone by talking about it. But I've always found that when it does come up, that the upset factor goes away very fast, and people are actually glad that it was mentioned because everyone seems to have a story, if not of their own, then of their mothers or sisters or friend or someone, and that connection then definitely does become very strong, and then the conversations just keep going once they're allowed to be out in the open.
One thing that made it, I mean, my family, my in-laws in Mongolia don't speak English, so they don't have copies of this book. But it actually it's sort of culturally fairly taboo that I would have even done this. Like this wouldn't have happened. Like if there was a Mongolian version of Kalia and Shannon, and they wanted to publish this book, they wouldn't. They would have had a really hard time. You don't talk about the dead. You don't talk about dying. You certainly don't talk about dead babies when there are pregnant women in your family. You don't talk about hysterectomies when you have, I mean, there's just so much. It to me, I mean, as an American, I see that as well, but like living here and within Mongolian culture, it's like amplified. And yeah, and that was something that was hard to deal with when it happened, but it hasn't, in some ways, it hasn't really gotten any easier. And so, being able to say, with other books that I've been in, and other anthologies, I've been able to share sort of the excitement of, here it is, here's my name, and this is exciting. And with this book, it's really difficult to do. And I explained to my husband what it was about, and he just, he knew I was writing it, or he knew that it was going to be published. But when he saw the book, he was just, like, like my weird American wife who talks about things that shouldn't be talked about, like, I don't know, it's a little strange, on that level. So family back home, it's a bit different. There's obviously a different understanding of what it meant to be part of this book and what the book represents, for the larger universe of readers.
I hear you, Michelle. I'm wrong, and I come from a refugee background. In my community, when we talk about the heartaches, So often it's connected to the war. But I know that every single woman in my life, my grandmother, my aunts, they've all lost children. They've all had miscarriages along the way. And it isn't until, it wasn't until I experienced my own loss that my mother's older sister, my she came to visit and she sat down and she looked at me and I looked at her and she said, "You know that the longer you have with someone, the more you love them." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Your baby Jules was 16 weeks. I've never told you, but do you know that I had a miscarriage at 5 months? I had a stillbirth, and then I lost a 1-year-old, and then I lost a 2-year-old, and I lost a 3-year-old."
Oh my God.
And I looked at her and she said, "And every single one that I lost, the more time I had with them, uh, the harder it was to let go, the harder it has been for the life that I'm living today." But it was, one of the gifts, I think, and this is something that I'm hearing again, is once these stories are out, they invite more stories out. But in a community like mine, where so much happened because of a singular war, the fact that these women have survived grant these losses a different kind of position. And by writing this book and by entering into these conversations, I feel at times I am changing the position of these losses in the lives of these women who have raised me, and also the women I'm becoming.
Hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a lot. I mean, I feel like so many stories in this book, it's like, you know, it's about, I mean, I hate to say it this way because it makes it seem like losing a child, losing a pregnancy isn't a big deal, but, it's about so much more than that, It's, so many of the stories are about structural and institutional racism uh, in the healthcare system,
Yes,
and so many of the stories are, Sonia, when I read your piece, I mean, your piece is about obviously, a lot of different things, but, that was the first piece that Kalia and I had read about from a Muslim perspective, um,
Mm-hmm.
on losing a child, right? And what you and your husband and your family went through trying to feel like that life was honored.
For me, it worked on two levels, but other levels too. But I think for me, the person who is carrying the child who is pregnant feels the enormity of that life the most at first, right? Because you're carrying this baby, this life within you, and everyone else just your family members, etc. um your husband, etc. They just hear that, okay, you're pregnant. They can't really see anything, they can't feel anything, nothing is changing in their bodies. And I think sometimes for a lot of men, it's not till they see the bump or they feel movement or hear the heartbeat that it suddenly becomes real, and then really becomes real once you're much further term, and perhaps once the baby comes out. So I mean, I lost I'd had miscarriages before, and this particular one, on I started bleeding on the morning of the third month, and I didn't panic or anything. I just thought it was just another miscarriage, and I was like, okay. And I just returned from the gym, and I went to the doctor just to, I was expecting to be told it's not there. And then when she said that the heartbeat is still there, this had not happened before, so this was a shock to me, and suddenly it became more precious that this was, and then that carried on for a month, and it was a difficult month because it's just I at least felt very alone because there were so many emotions as a mother, or even as a pregnant mother. You try to keep your child safe as best as you can, and then when we're in these precarious circumstances where we suddenly can't, what it means to be a mother and what it means to carry a child in safety, as well as keeping perhaps the children that you already have safe, everything starts to just you start to question a lot of things. But then the added layer, and then once it happened, I miscarried at 4 months and actually into my hands. It was very traumatic for so many different reasons than my previous miscarriages. But I thought I'd put it to rest. And then a month afterwards, I get a call from the, from the perinatal clinic, and they say that they're remains and what do I want to do with them, and everything just came rushing back. And as a Muslim, actually, I had not realized this, or I had, but it hadn't really, it hadn't, the impact, it hadn't had an impact yet, that uh, Muslims believe that the soul doesn't enter a fetus until 4 months, 16 weeks. And since I was right at the cusp, like no one could pinpoint whether it was, 15 and 1 day or 6, when we called a mosque to ask about burial stuff, they said that, well, since they don't know if it was completely 16 weeks, it wasn't a lot, there was no soul there, it wasn't. And that was just the double trauma of being told that the baby that I'd given a name to, bought socks for, had grieved for so badly, was really not considered a human being, a child. That double trauma was very, very, very terrible. And then he went on later to be buried in a mass urn, and that brought up all sorts of things also. So just, you talked about layers and Muslim background and stuff. Yeah, it was a very, very traumatic experience, one after the other. It was the miscarriage, then it was the burial, then it was where he was finally going to be buried. And it was just, for a long time, I just, every time I thought I was healing a little bit, there would be another hammer. And it was very tough, very tough.
Thank you for sharing that, Sonia. We had another submission which we ultimately decided that we could not take because we wanted to keep the focus on Indigenous and women of color. But we had a submission from a Jewish woman who unfortunately had a loss at, I think it was around 37 weeks. And reading your piece, Sonia, the response of the rabbi, again, I don't, um, I'm not an expert at all on the particulars of either the Muslim faith or the Jewish faith, but the similarities in the responses of of these sort of like elders in those religious communities, and how devastating that was to both you and her. I mean, I think she actually ended up leaving Judaism because of it, and that was just something that was a layer. I'm a Buddhist, but it's just different. It's more secular for me. That was a layer that I had not anticipated, coming across or dealing with and putting this together. Another piece that I hadn't anticipated reading through the pieces was this idea of what Seema brought up. Because we don't talk about these things, whatever they are, these traumas usually, you think that you sort of keep these secret, torturous thoughts to yourself, right? And this thought that it's my fault. I could have done something, right? In my case, I had a stillbirth at 41 and a half weeks, right? And so there was no cause of death, right? They never determined ultimately the cause of death, like in many, many stillbirths. And it just kept on going through my mind. Like, I did go in, right? But I should have gone in, at a week, and I should have, a week after she was due, and I should have told them that, they had to induce, and I should have done this and I should have done that. Like, and it sounds so banal to say, right now, but then somehow I didn't understand that that was like a shared experience of women who go through this, reading the first person accounts. Um, so many women had that same sense of profound guilt laced with the loss. And that actually was so healing for me. I don't know if that makes sense, but it was.
Yeah, no, this is Sonia again. Just to go back a moment to what you said, the whole thing about a mother, and it certainly brings up what it means to be a mother before you have a baby in your arms, because everyone can immediately tell you're a mother then, and that this is a baby, and everyone wants to protect your feelings, the baby's feelings, life, etc. But like you're saying, in cases like this, who has the agency to tell someone at what stage that baby had life and meaning and didn't? And that really, that was very unsettling, in all cases, in a lot of the stories that I was reading, which is, what does it mean to be a mother when your emotions are so strong, but when others are not honoring those emotions? and saying that, it's okay and you can have another and you can get over it and it wasn't meant to be and stuff like that from different religious perspectives. So.
I think that it resonates so strongly. Similarly, for so many of us as Indigenous women and women of color, there's this mental strength that we're expected to wear. How many men have come up to me after the experience of this collection and said, "My mother had miscarriages. She was so strong." For me, part of the power of this collection is that we're crying, we're weeping. There is no trying to be strong in writing these stories. From my own experience of writing my own story and then my mother's story for this collection, my story felt like a dream, and writing my mom's story felt like waking up in a nightmare. I remember the first time reading the submissions as they were coming in, along with Shannon Gibney crying and crying for all of the babies that were lost, that have been lost throughout time, and somehow those tears became the tears for the babies now in cages at the borders. The ones taken away by by white colonists, the native babies, or the ones African American babies taken away to become slaves, or Hmong babies taken to become soldiers in a war that could never benefit them. That was for me incredibly liberating. Just to say, I'm hurting, we've all been hurting, and I don't care what you think.
Right, because we're socialized as women to take care of other people first, right? I mean, that's what that whole strength thing is about, right? They wouldn't they wouldn't be praising us for being strong, quote unquote, if we were being strong and taking care of ourselves first when nobody else. you know, which is what men are socialized to do.
Right. The discomfort, this is Seema, the discomfort with other people's discomfort is right. If we were being strong in a way that didn't let them stay comfortable. And when I received the anthology, I thought I had done my deep weeping already. It had been many years. But when the anthology arrived, I took it to bed. I was alone and I read it and wept in a way that was so different from all of the other times I had wept along those lines of like, I was weeping not just for my loss, but for the universality of the loss and not feeling like it was a burden on other people, my grief, right? Like being part of this act of grief together with all of you across space. I hadn't met anybody um, else who was in the anthology at that time. But it just felt so like, oh, this is a line that I'm connected to, a global sort of web that I'm connected to. And that was a really beautiful, powerful thing.
Yeah, and just I had a similar, this is Jami. I had a similar experience when I read the anthology as well, of just being able to say that everyone in this book is acknowledging these losses that often are just not acknowledged or not taken seriously. And just the connections that you were talking about, not just to our losses, but to the things that are happening nationally. And I think one thing that I connected to now is this idea of feeling like people aren't taking your baby seriously, or that your loss is not a baby. And I think that for me was one of the hardest parts after my miscarriage, of people thinking like, oh, it's just a miscarriage, or feeling like I had to feel like that I was wrong for grieving. And I remember talking about it with my therapist, and my therapist said something offhand about like, oh, it's 10 weeks, it's not really a baby. And I was devastated because that was like in therapy. And she was saying something like, oh, another of her clients had lost a baby, in a stillbirth, and that was really a baby, but that mine didn't have a soul, and just all these different things that were not helpful at the time. And here in this book, I felt like it's a place where my grief could be seen, and where it was acknowledged and allowed in a way that didn't make me feel like I had to be guilty, or that I was selfish for being sad and for being upset about this loss of, all this possibility. I think that was one of the most powerful things to me when I was reading it.
Going back to the guilt thing, my daughter hasn't been in school since January. We went to the U.S. for Christmas and New Year's, and we came back. Coronavirus had been in the news here, but it sort of exploded, and they closed. Like, it was a week after we got back. They locked everything down, and then a few weeks later they shut down the border. And one of the things that they also did was not allow kids out into public spaces. So it's only a couple weeks ago that my daughter got to come with me to the grocery store again, and so it's been intense because she's sick of she was sick of me and I was sick of her. We were having this sort of tension, and she started bringing up the fact a lot, uh, repeatedly, like, I wish I wasn't an only child. I wish my brother hadn't died, and just hitting me with all this stuff. And I was just like, oh God, like, I could it get any worse? And she also is aware. We talked about it more actually after the book, and after I got a chance to read other stories and sort of process things, and echoing a lot of other people's impressions and feelings when they did so. But so yeah, we in the last year or so, we've talked a lot more about all of what it entails. And in my instance, it was a hysterectomy that followed the delivery of my son. And I've spent the last few years feeling like the weight of that, and just the fact that there's no hope that this body's gonna make another baby, and that's done. And my daughter understands that. And when she says it, of course, she's 7 and she doesn't know the weight of that guilt and the weight of her words. But oh my God, was I glad to get her back out into the world and interacting, and not just having to be stuck with her and her only child misery.
I feel that keenly. There's a house in our block, and we visited when we were looking for homes. It was on sale at the same time as our house, and when we visited, I was pregnant with the twins. I have 4 identical twin boys who are 4 going on 5. And we were to pass the house, and we started talking about our visit there, and the boys said, "Oh yeah, we've been inside that house." And I'm like, You were inside of me?" And they said, "No, mommy, in the baby world." And I said, "What do you mean?" And they said, "In the baby world, mommy, when you were inside that house, there was another little boy." My heart, my poor heart started hammering. I thought, what are they gonna say to me? And they were both nodding, and they're like, "There was another little boy. He was a ghost boy, mommy, and he wanted to come, but we chased him away. We said no. There's 2 of us already, and we're here, and we're not gonna live here with you." So we chased him away. And of course, you could just be bantering among children, of course, in their imagination. But in my heart, I was hammering so fast. I thought, what are they gonna tell me? What happened inside that place of the baby world inside of me? And maybe for the rest of so many of our lives, there'll always be these moments when things will be said in our lives or around us, where we'll start wondering if there's a clue there somewhere, or if there's a way into that space of leaving. I'm not sure how it is for the rest of you, but yeah, with these little guys, every time they bring up the baby world, I'm tense. I'm I'm very open with them about the loss of baby Jules, and I try to explain as best I can how these things uh, go in life. But when they start explaining the worlds before they are part of mine to me, I'm like, what are they gonna say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they have a child sensibility, right? I mean, as Sonia was talking about, they're not in your body, they didn't carry the baby. It just they have a different relationship to it. My kids, um, their sister that died, her name was CNA, and they constantly know if CNA were here now, we would have to get a new car because there's no way we could fit her in here. If CNA were here now, she'd probably like these hot dogs. If CNA were here now, she could stay, in my room and, et cetera, et cetera. And it's become part of our family story, I think, in a very healthy way. But it does, as Kalia's talking about, it's like a knife in your heart.
Yeah.
You're just going about your day and then you'll, oh my
Yeah.
God, you know.
I think what also for me struck me was that my kids were much younger when this happened. They were around, this is Sonia, they were in kindergarten and first grade or so. And just to tell them or explain, because we had, the ultrasound picture was up on the fridge and we've named him, and because the doctors kept telling me that he's going to come out and be playing soccer before I know it. So to tell kids at that age is so different from telling older kids. And I think I they try to process it differently. And as I say in my essay, my son had his best friend, his father had passed away. And so I was able to explain it to my son in terms of, the baby's gone where Dylan's father is. But I think having written the essay and then seeing them read it when they were older and seeing their names on the page and seeing his name on the page, I mean, there's a life that the page gives that is very unexpected also, because suddenly they are alive in the page and in our memories, but also when others read that, when family members read it or friends or even strangers read it, for a moment that life that was there so fleeting comes back to life, so to speak, if that makes sense. And I think for my children, watching them process it when they were so little, and then watching them process it when they were older and able to read themselves on the page and see themselves in the story, in our family story that had taken place. And really, I was able to have a child after my miscarriage, and that brings up its own interesting conversations. Like, my this is so hard, but like when that child asks, because I've written an essay about this miscarriage, it's on paper, there's no, so when that child, the first time that child asks, well, if you hadn't miscarried, would I have come? It's a very, very difficult question to know how to answer, really, in all its complications. And it makes everything so much, it just brings an added pain in a way, if that makes sense. Um, you know?
Yeah, I think this is Michelle. What I didn't think about when it happened was that my daughter would be grieving too. It's a whole other thing, and I part of me is got when you talk about your kids being able to read it, I'm excited for that day, but I'm also like terrified, of putting more baggage onto my daughter, to understand what that experience was. But the beauty of the anthology is that she's not just going to be reading my stories; she's going to be reading all these other women's stories to know that this is something that happens, and how it happens, differently and yet the same.
And also, I mean, I think the other thing is like, kids, yeah, it is scary to think about just your kids maturing, right? And sort of, because we know how hard and frankly often brutal the world can be, right? And some of the things that we've had to carry, being in it. But at the same time, it's like, even if my kids were experiencing something differently than me, it's like they always know, like kids always know, um, when something is afoot. And I know this is not true for everyone, but I think for me, it has been cathartic to write the stories down, in different contexts. And because I share the stories with my children too. I haven't shared the essay in here with them. They're still too young. They're 5 and they're 10. But I have written a children's book called Where Is My Sister? And I read that to them, the draft, and they 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 really liked it. You know, it was a good conversation.
I have 3 younger sisters, and they were all at the initial launch events, and I saw them weeping in the audience, but when I talked to them about it, they said, we wish we could have read this in college. It would have tied so many strings together." And I just looked at them, you know, as their older sister who loves them very much. I, of course, never want them to have to go through what I've been through, what all of us have been through. But I also know, because I know what happened to me, I know what happened to all of you, that these things happen regardless of where we are, regardless of who we are. It happens disproportionately to Indigenous women and women of color. And because these are 3 young women of color, I'd rather they knew than didn't, than live their lives without the knowing. I think that conversation, I'm raising children of color, and so we're talking about this moment in history in very different ways than the family across our street who are raising white kids in a predominantly white neighborhood, in a predominantly white city, in a predominantly white state, in a predominantly white country, in a world where the power is disproportionately taken by white folk. And I'd rather my kids know than not know and somehow chance upon it and fall in the flames that I know are waiting to consume them. I think that's part of the power of this book.
And I mean, one book can't do everything, and it can't be everything to all people.
What about Shakespeare, Shannon? Just joking with you.
Okay, you can dog out Shakespeare on your own time. That's one white man whose work I love. um, True talk. But I, I feel like we make the books, we tell the stories that it's a starting place. And so again, what I said before, I mean, I hope the book opens up space. And another one of my friends, queer black woman, has a daughter by partnership, has never given birth or been pregnant, but she said, no, just the fact that you all said, no, we think this is a topic that is important enough to take be within an entire book, right? We're going to have an entire book on this topic. Is that important? She said, it gives you pause, and that's a powerful statement, particularly as women, and particularly as we know the genre of memoir, uh, since the Enlightenment forward, has been dominated by white men. And so, what does it mean to really not only center those first person narratives in that genre in the voices and experiences of women of color and Indigenous women, particularly talking about pregnancy and infant loss?
This is Michelle. When I lost my son, a friend, she was my best friend in fifth grade or sixth grade, and then up through seventh grade, and I hadn't talked to her in years. Um, we spoke a little bit when we were in college, and somehow through the grapevine, she had heard about what happened, and sent me "Empty Cradle, Broken Heart," I think is the name of the book, something like that. And I didn't touch it. I've not read a single page of it all the way through. I opened up one page. I opened it to one page and I read it, and it wasn't for me. It wasn't written for me. It wasn't my story. It wasn't anything. Like, I just knew, and I did. But it's weird because it's again, it's like the weird feelings of guilt. Like, she had tried, she had put herself out there to say, I feel your loss. She said that she had experienced many miscarriages. Like, that was something for a couple of years where I was just like, I'd like to read something, like I don't have a therapist here. I didn't have the kind of community I had in the US. So I would normally go to a book or something like that, to sort of work through things or hear things and try to make sense of things. And I'm thrilled. I mean, I hate that this book exists, just on principle, and in the fact that these things happened, and we wrote about them. But I'm also incredibly grateful that if there's a woman like me out there, which I know there is, and will be, that they'll see that there's a book that is for them, and represents a voice, or shares a voice that represents their experience. And there's a political aspect of this, that this book that I was sent doesn't even dare to acknowledge. It's not about that, right? It's just about, yeah, I don't even know. I can't speak for the book. I can't say what that book is about, right? I've not read a full complete page, but there's an industry for this, right? Like, there's a whole series of books that have been written about this, and this is the first that tells a different story.
Yeah, there's a lot of like very religious, very Christian,
Yeah.
and also just very, I don't know, using a lot of language that I feel is very overused and familiar. My angel, you know, the empty cradle, broken heart. Like, what does that mean now? Like, to
Right.
me, like the stuff that's just been it's been used so many times that it doesn't mean anything, right? I wanted something again, and people ask Kalia and I about the meaning of the title. Like, well, why did you title it that? And go back to Kalia's story of encountering this line in this amazing Lucille Clifton poem, um, and sharing it with me, and both of us feeling like this is it, you know, that moment in the middle of the night, right, where it just is like your soul is howling, right, and but there's nobody there to hear it. Your baby is dead, and there's no bringing them back. What, and then you ask the wall what God is honored here. What is this place that we've come to now? What God is honored here. And I wanted something that really talked about what happens in your body, right? I mean, it's not pretty for and when you go through something like this, the platitudes just don't suffice. They just don't work. And for me, that also has to do a lot with how like whiteness is constructed, right? And we're, it's this like repressive force. Um, and that's what at least I encountered in a lot of the literature about this topic when I went through my loss. And I'm a writer. That's what I do. I'm a reader and writer. It's like I have an experience, and then I try to find writing that speaks to that experience, and I just was finding nothing.
Similarly to the title, I think one of the hardest things for us in terms of the publishing of this book, and I don't know if you all knew, but was the cover. All of the covers that were presented, Shannon and I just felt we didn't want all of our stories wrapped in pastels. We didn't want it wrapped in dripping blood. We didn't want a photo of autumn and a still lake. And so the cover that we have, I stumbled upon a good poet friend is also a wonderful photographer, and he had this photo of this river surging where the mist meets the falling snowflakes. And finally, because we couldn't come up with the right cover, no cover seemed to could do it. Shannon and I both agreed that maybe this cover would somehow speak to something that we've all felt before.
It works. Well chosen.
Yeah, people have told me that they have a visceral reaction to looking at the cover, which is what we wanted.
Yeah, this is Sonia. I'd love to know if, now that it's been out for a while, what you might have done differently with it, and what the responses have been that you've liked, or just in general, both Kalia and Shannon. Because as the editors, I'm assuming most of the responses and everything come to you guys. So what have you been finding overall?
So the book now, it's nearly been a year. I was scheduled to give a talk at the Mayo Society, and this was gonna be the book that we were gonna focus on. They were gonna get a copy for a lot of the medical personnel who is a part of the society. Of course, that talk has long been canceled. But one of, I think, Shannon and one of our hopes is to get this book into the actual practitioners, the doctors and the medical students and the nurses and the midwives and the actual caretakers and caregivers. Part of the problem, yes, but necessarily part of the answer. We were very hopeful of that. Thankfully, Shannon Gibney, and this is one of the truths. I am so happy that we Shannon and I worked on this book as a team. We're a wonderful team because we're wonderfully different, but we're also wonderfully, Shannon would say we were all hustlers, all of us, to start off with writing. We're all
I mean,
hustlers.
we can't get anywhere as women, as Native and women of color. Like, we can't get anything if we don't hustle. It's just the way it is.
So Shannon and I will be presenting at Wayne State Medical School on this text and this work. I think that this book belongs in the hands of students. Unfortunately, most professors are male, and so the book isn't quite traveling as far in terms of its teaching capacity as I would like. In a different world, I do a lot of public talks, and I would focus on this book, and part of being a woman of color is always the things that I say and the things that I work on are never quite what people expect of me. So I am planning, and because I believe in the life of this book. I believe that it will live long beyond all of us, and it is a groundbreaking collection. This book is incredibly relevant to our current moment. You know, we are talking about equity, we're talking about racism, we're talking about all of the things that we've been needing to talk about, that within our circles, we've individually been trying to speak about as a nation for the very first time in a very long time. And so I think that the work that the book needs is only still beginning. With that aside, every time we give a talk, every time I meet anybody and they've had experience with this book, they say, "How can I tell my story?" Just this morning, Shannon and I were on a call together, and a woman, African American woman, said, "Shannon, teach me how to write my story."
Oh.
So the book, maybe we're looking at the first edition. Maybe this is going to become a much bigger book in time. What do you think, Shannon?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think as usual, you said it really well. It's really just the beginning, and I think it's just so much of the deep work, deep cultural work is about relationships. And it just takes time to cultivate those relationships. I mean, the reason why we're doing the ground mounts talk for the OBGYN residents at Wayne State Medical School is because my mom it's her really good friend that she worked with as a nurse in the NICU at University of Michigan Hospitals for years. Her daughter is a third year in that program, and my mom, gave her friend a copy of the book. He passed it on to this woman who, a majority of their patients at Wayne State, in Detroit, are lower income, basically like poor Black women. Their pregnancies do not, I mean, they have very bad maternal health and neonatal outcomes, right? And so she recognized, like, wow, this is something that's so relevant that nobody talks about, that we need to talk about. And I don't know if I told you this, Kalia, but my mom's friend, Kalia, and I said that we didn't want to be paid. We just wanted each resident who will be at the talk to get a copy of the book. And so this young woman's mother bought 50 copies of the book and donated them to the program to make that possible, which was just amazing. But it's those kinds of things that, it just takes time. So I feel like it's like the book is penetrating in certain communities. As I said, I've been hearing from friends and other people, acquaintances, etc. People have written me out of the blue and gone out of their way to be like, "Oh my God, thank you so much for this book. I never wanted to need it, but I need it so bad right now." And they have shared the most personal, harrowing stories, with Kalia and I. It's just so moving. And I do feel like in Minnesota, we've gotten a lot of traction just because that's where Kalia and I are based, and now people now know who we are, etc. Nationally, I think definitely we'd like to see, just some more connections made. But I do feel like we're hitting our stride. A lot of folks in the anthology are hitting their stride, and so the book isn't going anywhere. It's like it's gonna kind of like travel with us as our careers go forward as well. So I do feel like it's going to be a very slow snowball, to get yet another metaphor in the mix.
One thing that I think Shannon and I both agree on is that we couldn't have envisioned a stronger team of writers. It was super important to both of us that this collection be literary, that the writing be exquisite, and it is. And all of you are so wonderful. The individuals that we've gone to meet, and like Michelle, this is the first time we're hearing your voice, and it's even more badass than I imagined. So this is just, it's been a gift, a friendship, this sisterhood that stretches the globe, made of phenomenally smart, thoughtful, deeply feeling women. That's
Yeah,
been the biggest gift.
yeah, it's been incredible. And just that, also to plug the press, the support for the press, we were able to bring a good portion of the contributors in for the book launches. We had two big events, and it was so powerful and moving. And I mean, after I read part of my piece, I was the last reader at the one in St. Paul at St. Catherine University. And I mean, I just broke down crying, and kind of like what Seema was saying, it was a different kind of crying though, because it was just like, these are people who get it at the deepest level of getting it, right? And I don't have to worry that I'm being a burden to them. I don't have to worry that like they're not going to get it. I mean, I don't, none of that was there. So it does feel like a sisterhood.
And we came from the right editor, Eric Anderson. He's a white guy. He's experienced his own losses, but he also just believes in the trajectory of our vision for the book. And then all of the writers in the book. It's not very often that you get an editor who believes in your vision for something and then the team that you're bringing to the table. And so it's really been that, in that way, we've been really fortunate and gifted. The press, the editor, the team. I think that when we think back to this book, all of us, when we think about the body of our work, we'll all be very proud when all is said and done. When I think about the body of my own work, I'm incredibly moved by this book. It's not a book that the world is excited to read, people. It's not a book that people are clamoring to hear, but it is a book of truth. It is a book of necessity. That is the highest standard that any writer can aspire toward in terms of communicating what this humble human experience is like. So no regrets, no sorrows there.
Yeah. I just want to thank you all so much for taking time and sharing your stories and your views. So thank you again.
For more information, please visit z.umn.edu /WGIHH.